It's my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, who is Rebecca Crawford. Beck, do you have your camera on? Beck is from Child Fund Australia, or currently at Child Fund Australia, in a Senior Child Protection Officer role. But she's got a very sort of extensive work history, a sort of career that's built over a number of years now in the humanitarian and not-for-profit sectors. And I guess in her role, she was originally trained as a social worker. So she's got a very diverse skill set and a wide range of experiences to draw on. But among the many hats that Beck wears at Child Fund currently, she's been a prime mover in an initiative in partnership with Plan International Australia to tailor online safety education materials for children and their families in the Pacific region. And I'm sure Beck will say more about this in a moment, but as you may know, the Australian government has invested very heavily in providing digital infrastructure, and so Plan International and Child Fund Australia have been working together to kind of prepare children for the possibility that they are going to come online at a faster and faster rate in the near future. So please welcome Rebecca Crawford. Beck, over to you.
Hi, thanks very much for that, Amanda. I'm sorry, just if everyone can bear with me for a second, I am trying to share my slides. I am about to talk about online safety and use of the online world, and I always do find that amusing when we are the ones that are probably find it often extremely difficult to share and use the technology. So I'm sorry, I know you can sort of see the you can see all of the slides there, but for whatever reason, it won't let me go otherwise. But yes, thank you very much, Amanda, for that very kind introduction. And thank you very much for the invitation to come and speak today about Child Fund's experience in interacting and having the opportunity to be part of using the Living Lab innovation to have direct impact and implications for our work that we're doing in the Pacific. So I thought I would just start out by actually giving a bit of an overview about how it is that we actually came together and how it is that Child Fund and Plan International Australia were able to interact with the Living Lab methodologies. So it's actually thanks to Amanda, who's online with us, so Professor Amanda Third, Dr. Girish Lala, Ms. Lily Moody, and Dr. Nukte Ugan, who are all part of the Young and Resilient Research Centre, who are part of Western Sydney University. So they really gave us access to these methodologies, and it has for both Child Fund Australia and Plan International Australia in the context of our child protection work, really focusing in on online safety for children across the Pacific. It has given us a lot of access and insight to essential knowledge and essential data sets that we were not able to access prior to this. So just to give you a little bit of background again about how we all came together to do that, Child Fund Australia and Plan International, we are international child-focused organisations who program internationally in child protection. And one area of focus amongst all of the child protection work that we do for both Child Fund Australia and Plan International is around online safety. So for Child Fund Australia, we're actually part of an alliance of 11 organisations who operate, who implement and operate in 60 countries globally. But for Child Fund Australia and Plan International Australia, our areas of focus really on protection are across the Southeast Asia and Pacific region. So that's Cambodia, Myanmar, Vietnam, Timor-Leste, PNG, Laos, and then in Kiribati, Solomon Islands, Fiji, and Vanuatu. So we have been running quite extensive and comprehensive interventions around online safety across Southeast Asia through methodologies that we call Swipe Safe. So it's a program that we launched initially in Vietnam. as under the Ending Violence Against Children Fund. And the intervention itself is very much focused on capturing the ecosystems and a holistic view to children's safety online. So that is, working on interventions directly with children themselves to increase their own knowledge and protective skills when they are working online, but also to link in with their key their key safety partners. So that is their parents, other wider community members, places where they're actually accessing the internet, and seeing how that is connected to their whole of life experience. So in relation to how we started to come together and make this connection, both Child Fund Australia and Plan International Australia have been expanding our work into the Pacific, and one area of our child protection program there is to really think about and address how child safety online is thought about and is responded to in the context of, at the moment, Solomon Islands, Kiribati, and Papua New Guinea. So I'm not sure how much of you know about the context of the Pacific and access to internet across the Pacific. However, over the last couple of years, there has been a cable net system, which is the Coral Sea cable, which is being rapidly rolled out across the Pacific. So this is heralding an era of increased access to affordable and fast connectivity across the region, which sets to expand and open up to some of the most remote places on Earth, rapid access to the internet. So this of course does open up a number of extremely exciting opportunities, but then does also come along with risks for children and young people as well, in terms of how they would be accessing, using, be potentially vulnerable through rapid access to the internet. So where we came together to use this Living Lab methodology was Child Fund Australia and Plan International Australia had the intention to move across and take some of the lessons learned we had in Southeast Asia and think about how we could implement our swipe safe methodologies in the context of the Solomon Islands. As we were running or intended on rolling out a pilot in the context of the Solomons, there has been a huge deficit of reliable evidence across the region to guide policy decision making in relation to children's digital practices at all on online safety. So it really was a blind spot. So in terms of our advocacy in relation to introducing and sensitizing this as an issue to be addressed in the context of the Pacific, we were coming up against having no baseline, no research available whatsoever. So this is really where the connection of with the Young and Resilient Research Centre and Western Sydney University came into play, and it was put forward to us by Professor Third and her team that the Living Lab methodology may be a way for us to actually start to be able to access that essential and novel information directly from children themselves, directly from youth, and those support networks that really fits within the ecological model that we would seek to work with, or had previously done so in other contexts, to address both the opportunity and risks online. And in the context of the work that we are doing in international development, it is common practice for us to start out with baselines and undertake research ourselves. We attempt to engage in participatory methodologies to do this. We do a lot of community-based work and try to model our design based on community voices. This is where we actually had, again, a big deficit and no visibility across the Pacific around the types of communities and the voices that needed to be considered here. Similarly, in the development world, we often place a lot of our baseline information is very heavily weighted towards quantitative baselines, whereas in the context of what we wanted to look at in the Pacific, the Living Lab methodologies were able to actually provide us with a largely qualitative baseline, which has opened up a number of opportunities to actually be able to have young people as the drivers, and actually the communities of the drivers, about how online safety should be addressed in their own context. And almost we would like to think before, as access is opening up, their voices are now driving what happens in the future. So there's an element of hopefully the prevention work that will be driven by young people and their safety partners as well. In terms of direct project implementation and how the Living Lab has been instrumental in what we have, where we have landed in the context of our work in the Pacific, one of the key drives of our project around online safety is very much to engage with police and government ministries to progress the adoption of cross-sector and sort of a multi-pronged government coordinated approaches to addressing online safety. And the context of the Pacific, so especially the Solomon Islands, is such that it is a very newly legislated environment for anything to do with protection. So prior to 2016 in the Solomon Islands, there wasn't even a national government mandate as to who was responsible for the overall protection or safety of children. So in relation to being able to approach the issue of online safety in a context where the issue of children's safety being addressed at a national level was already extremely new, being able to use the Living Lab process of bringing forward the voices of children, young people, their supportive partners through their parents, teachers and others, but also have those key government stakeholders, those key NGO stakeholders, those key policing stakeholder voices around the table. One of the direct benefits that we actually saw from the Living Lab methodologies and bringing forward the number of findings we had from that research was the coordination piece that we were starting to do on addressing safety online. Actually, by going through those processes and bringing all of those voices around the table, we kick-started that coordination process around actually having those very key policy conversations that often takes us a very long time to do now. We're not saying it with our silver bullet, but it really has started the process for us to think about the review of existing legislation and maybe where the different voices that were harnessed through that. So we're talking about young people, but also other stakeholders beyond the traditional actors who would be looking at the development of policy, to think about how does the existing legislation, how does that become live in its application, which is a step that we often, in terms of policy creation, it's left to the afterthought. So here it's brought forward ideas about how do we actually need to potentially think about what education of online education means at the policy level, alongside other policy that would be assessing prevention of serious online crime for children. And this by having the by using the Living Lab methodologies, this is sort of really very much brought that to the fore for us as well. One of the other key and direct benefits of the Living Lab methodologies for the program and project itself is that it has allowed us to kickstart the iterative program design, refinement and contextualization of the intervention specifically for the Solomon Islands, which is our pilot country. But it has allowed for the voice and input of Pacific children to come into exactly what the opportunities are from their perspective and where they actually see some of the risks emerging for themselves, which we understood that there would be unique elements to this, but what that means for us in being able to refine a package of information to be most relevant to these young people, it has really come a long way in terms of from our pilot sessions of which was running alongside the initial piece of research that used the Living Lab methodologies, to be able to think about how this information will resonate better with children and young people, what it will mean for them longer term, but also how it has the opportunity and the double application of actually creating a body of evidence that children and young people are able to use as a platform for raising their own voice in their own country contexts as well. The methodology used by the Living Lab research as well, by engaging multiple stakeholders, fits perfectly with our approach in terms of programming child protection interventions, which brings in the ecological model of not just thinking of the child or in isolation, but thinking about all of the protective and vulnerability factors around that child, from policy to services available to them, and the primary protective networks around them as well. So there was very much a complementary avenue for the Living Lab to feed directly into what we were doing. It also really gave us an opportunity around contextualizing, so moving into new environments such as the Solomon Islands to address online safety. We had big questions about whether where these sorts of interventions or access to education would be best embedded. So whether this was in the education system, as we had previously done in contexts across Southeast Asia or in Vietnam, whether it was through policing and community family interventions, or the church system. Now, these might seem like small questions, but it really was youth-led responses around where they would actually enact their own information and self-help seeking behaviours that has guided the way we have now decided to look at the ecosystems that we would target around these children and young people to increase their levels of safety. So there were messages coming out from the context of the Solomon Islands around connections with church and integration with religion that had not been part of the design before, as to where those important voices have come from in terms of the education picture and what that means. So this is something that we have had to sort of take a step back in terms of the way that we are designing our program, and think about how we would be opening things up to those to those new groups of key and important stakeholders in a child's protective ecosystem. It was also really important for us to think about the relevance and coherence. So looking at potentially other education products that exist within the context of the Pacific. A number of those were have been delivered through community policing, and they may have been targeted at youth. However, some of the methodologies have focused on restrictive and limited room for exploration of opportunities in terms of the online world. So really around this idea of relevance, it has given us an opportunity to take the voices of children and young people and apply that to settings around education packages that we had previously pitched as being focused on youth, to really refine the messages and the topics towards those that have been really raised with us by youth and their parents. It also has given us an opportunity to think about how the coherence of across the sector of what it is that we might be doing in community-based settings, and how that should be complemented and connected to what's actually happening with community policing and other key actors in this type of education work. Yep. One of the other direct implementations of the finding and the use of the Living Lab research was to really, in the design of the work that we're doing, it was an opportunity to really think about whether we were developing the right, all of the right partnerships throughout the interventions that we had considered undertaking. So by increasing our pool of key stakeholders to include telcos, other INGOs and non-traditional partners in this space as well, it has given us other avenues into that ecosystems model that previously we didn't have access and insight to, and they had predominantly hadn't been sitting around the table to be part of those discussions around how we would be focusing and have on children specifically. And it also, my last point there, I think I've already touched on, really the development of documented youth voice, which youth can use as a platform for their own advocacy as well. So understanding that that in the use of Living Lab is a way to generate and document extremely valuable qualitative evidence that, and one of the, child protection is only one of the areas of programming that Child Fund and Plan International undertake. Our other areas of programming are in education and also in child and youth empowerment. So looking at the issue itself, looking at actually how we can use the generation of this data, of these voices for children and youth to be able to access that information themselves and use it for their own points of advocacy. Knowing that I have spoken for quite a while already, I just wanted to touch on the how we are continuing to use the Living Lab methodologies for iterative implementation. So knowing that we started out using the Living Labs as a part of essentially discrete research, thinking about the next phase, so we've moved past our pilot intervention with these education packages, and now in our full rollout, the Living Lab methodologies, in conjunction with Amanda's team again at Western Sydney University, we have embedded the Living Lab process into the rollout of the current project, using a series of workshops, but predominantly to ensure that throughout the rollout of the full project that we are continuing to harness the voices and experiences of young people and reflect this in iterative programming. So we are readjusting as we're going along. We're also using the Living Lab methodologies to essentially inform our project level monitoring and evaluation, with and seeking to have this become a standard across the region, essentially for defining indicators around achievement of online safety, which is something that we are very excited to embark upon, and the methodology is really opening up access to that. Some additional positive and maybe unintended impacts that we observed is that the access and exposure of the participatory research methodologies for country officers and staff facilitators has opened up a lot of discussion around the way that we do things in our country offices. It was an opportunity that a number of my colleagues in country would not have had the ability to be exposed to in the way that they were. And so their participation in facilitation and being trained up has actually sparked more ideas around how to use particular parts of these methodologies in the future, which we found to be a very interesting additional positive impact. I've already touched on the increased contribution of voice. And really, if we're thinking about the Pacific Island context specifically, the ability for these small nations to contribute to global standards and data pools, which is informed by global standards, really has given them an opportunity in a way to have a voice and a pathway to contribute to big discussions that they are often overlooked in. So there were some other additional positive impacts, and the interest in continuing this research across. So we have touched upon 3 countries. There are over 14 Pacific Island nations. The interest to actually continue and perpetuate this research is large. So thank you very much for your time.
Beck, thanks for a really comprehensive discussion there. Do you need a rest, or can we ask you some questions?
No, please go for it.
No, so I think Anne's made a comment in the chat box. She says, thanks, Rebecca, for outlining the critical importance of the issue of child safety. I'm passionately interested about the issue of forgotten Australians, the estimated 500,000 Australians who, as a result of social and welfare policies of the 40s to the 80s, have experienced institutional care as children. The voice of the church is very negatively significant for those Australians as they age. Yes, and she says she'd love to talk about how applying living lab methodologies might be relevant to this group and as it is to current groups. So thanks for the presentation. But did you want to reflect on the role of the church and that disjuncture? Because the role of the church in the Pacific's not straightforward either, is it?
No, not at all. So I guess that in terms of the way that both Child Fund Australia and Plan International Australia operate, we are not-for-profits and we are non-religious based organisations. However, in the context of the Solomon Islands, in terms of any type of education, behaviour change, safety issues, the church plays a huge role in both the immediate protection of individuals. So if we actually look at the services that provide immediate protection to women and children, they are predominantly church-based structures who do so. A lot of the guidance around especially child protection issues, national policy is intertwined with religious teachings as well. So the day-to-day influence and relevance and positive impact of the church in the context of the Solomon Islands is paramount, and probably one of the closest protective factors that have been consistently identified by communities across the Pacific as being essential to day-to-day life and operations. So when we're very much thinking in terms of ecosystems models around protection of children, the church is paramount to that, and actually quite vocal around protection issues for children and young people in the Pacific.
Thanks, Beck. That's great. And look, I think we've got time for one more question. Is that right, Sonia?
Absolutely. And Phil just posted a question.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I'll go with Phil's question. He says, now young people and community have used this methodology. Do you see it as an important pathway for engagement on other critical issues affecting the Pacific Islands for young people?
100%. I think that in terms of the methodology itself, I think, thinking about the islands, there are a myriad of issues. If we just take climate change and voice on climate change and how that is affecting the entire Pacific, but also but acutely young people in the Pacific, what this means for them. They're watching their land mass disappear in terms of where their future lies physically. That is a very big question mark for them. And yes, I think it's very much so something that would be extremely important to be considered as a key methodology moving forward. Yeah.
Terrific. So, and Phil did say, sorry about that, it was probably a bit of a leading question, which it probably was, Phil. But so if I can counteract that a little bit, Phil, sorry, Beck, I'm wondering, like, you've talked a lot about the strengths of working in this way.
Mm-hmm.
Were there some hurdles that you had to navigate as an organisation, sort of, I guess, to work in this way? Was there anything that stood in your way or made it difficult?
If I was to reflect on other pieces of research that we've done, so I think that as a sector, the development sector, extremely open to participatory methodologies. However, there was a nervousness initially around the reliance on qualitative evidence and less on quantitative. I feel after this experience for Child Fund as an organisation that they have changed their mind somewhat. Not that we don't use a lot of qualitative evidence and qualitative methodologies in a lot of the work that we do. It's here, it's never done in isolation, and it's probably not done as the primary source of a primary methodology, or as something that could even be perceived as standalone. So that was maybe one of the things that sort of stood in our way. I think some of the other things as well, I mean, we talk about this research happening in the Pacific. We are talking about 3 separate and distinct nations. So in terms of how we were able to think about findings, and we need to come back to really thinking about not continuing to think about the Pacific as one, just the blue Pacific as a standard set of countries. They are unique countries with unique needs, and to be able to separate that out and highlight the individual needs and individual responses, we've got a bit more work to do around that, I feel. Yeah, and that's essentially where we've had some pushback, maybe from the countries themselves, around they are very much pushing for the their individual intervention and what it means for them individually. So they, if anything, they probably want to go even deeper on what they've sort of, the information that they have more than started out with.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, Beck, thank you so much for sharing that experience with us. Please, let's give her a virtual clap, however you do that, with your reactions down the bottom if you want to. That's a bit cheesy though, isn't it? All right, let's do it. Gareth's leading the way. And I will hand back to Sonia. Thanks again, Becca.